From the delicate ceremony of an ancient brew to the violent splash of defiance in a colonial harbor, tea has always been more than just a beverage. It is a paradox, a symbol of comfort, civility, and refined British identity, yet became the ultimate flashpoint for a revolution that would reshape the world. Tonight, we journey back to a pivotal moment where this beloved drink ignited the fires of freedom. Long before it fueled the anger in Boston, tea traveled vast distances, weaving its way through empires, trade routes, and social hierarchies. But in the 18th century, as the British Crown sought to tighten its grip on its American colonies, tea transformed from a simple commodity into a potent weapon, burdened by taxes and monopolies that many colonists viewed as an intolerable infringement on their rights. This documentary, Stolen Tea, Ignited Freedom, will explore the deep historical currents that converged on that fateful December night in 1773. We will uncover the ancient origins of tea, trace its path across continents, and reveal how a company's financial woes collided with a burgeoning colonial identity. We'll witness the growing tensions, the impassioned debates, and the desperate acts of protest that preceded the iconic Boston Tea Party. The stolen tea was not merely a physical act of destruction. It was a defiant declaration against perceived economic exploitation and the theft of fundamental liberties. Join us as we unravel the intricate tapestry of events that led to a daring act of rebellion, charting a course directly toward the birth of the United States of America. Our story begins not in the bustling ports of Boston, but in the ethereal mists of ancient China, over 5 millennia ago. Imagine a world where the very essence of nature held sacred power, and a simple leaf could transform from medicine to mystical elixir. This is where tea, the unassuming catalyst for revolution, first took root. Legend tells us of the Emperor Shun Nung, the divine farmer, in 2737 BCE. While boiling water under a wild tea tree, a few leaves drifted into his pot. He tasted the infusion, and in that serendipitous moment, a new world unfolded. It was bitter, yet invigorating, calming, yet stimulating. Shun Nung, already credited with discovering many medicinal herbs, recognized the profound properties of this humble plant, Camellia sinensis. Initially revered for its healing powers, tea was brewed as a tonic, a spiritual aid, and a stimulant for meditation. Buddhist monks embraced it, finding its clarity-inducing qualities perfect for long hours of contemplation. It became interwoven with spiritual practice, a conduit to inner peace and enlightenment. As centuries turned, tea's influence transcended the monastery walls, evolving into an art form, a philosophy. Elaborate tea ceremonies emerged, particularly in Japan, where Zen aesthetics shaped every pour, every sip, into a moment of mindful beauty. From China, its whispers traveled along ancient trade routes, across the Korean peninsula, into the islands of Japan, and south through Southeast Asia. Each culture adopted it, making it their own, weaving it into their social fabric, their daily rituals, their very identity. Long before any Western ship would ever anchor in an Eastern port, before the pursuit of this exotic leaf would spark empires and ignite revolutions, tea had already perfected the art of transformation, from a wild forest plant to an indispensable pillar of civilization. It was an elixir, yes, but more than that, it was a profound cultural language, spoken silently in countless cups across the ancient world. A journey of quietude and ceremony, soon to be irrevocably disrupted by the clamor of global commerce. The centuries-long reign of tea in the East was a story of quiet tradition and deep spiritual connection. But as the sails of European exploration unfurled, powered by insatiable curiosity and ambition, this tranquil narrative was destined for a dramatic shift. The 16th and 17th centuries marked a pivotal turning point as intrepid Portuguese and Dutch traders, venturing into the fabled Spice Islands and the distant shores of Asia, stumbled upon the enigmatic leaf that captivated the East. Initially, they sought spices, silks, and porcelain, but among these treasures, they discovered cha, as the Chinese called it. It was the Portuguese who first brought small quantities of tea back to Europe, primarily as exotic curiosities for the wealthy. But it was the Dutch, with their burgeoning global trade empire and the formidable Dutch East India Company, VOC, who truly introduced tea to the European consciousness. By the early 17th century, ships laden with tea began to arrive in Amsterdam. At first, it was a botanical oddity, then a medicinal marvel, advertised as a cure-all for everything from headaches to gout. Its rarity, however, quickly elevated its status. It became an exclusive luxury, a symbol of immense wealth and sophisticated taste, accessible only to the most aristocratic circles. Imagine the opulent salons of 17th-century Europe, chandeliers glistening, velvet curtains draped, and in the center, a tiny, intricately decorated porcelain cup, cradling this dark, aromatic liquid. Kings and queens, dukes and duchesses, savored its unique flavor, discussing its exotic origins and purported health benefits. The cost was astronomical, making it more valuable than gold or silver by weight in some instances. Tea was not merely a beverage. It was a declaration of status, a display of access to the furthest reaches of the globe. From the quiet contemplation of ancient monasteries, tea was thrust onto the grand, glittering stage of European high society, its destiny now entwined with the ambitions of empires and the whims of the elite. This humble leaf, once a symbol of Eastern serenity, was about to become an engine of Western power and, eventually, a flashpoint for rebellion. As tea captivated Europe, its allure was particularly potent in one island nation, destined to become synonymous with the beverage, Great Britain. Initially, tea's foothold in England was tentative, mirroring its status as an expensive aristocratic novelty across the continent. But a single figure would change everything, solidifying tea's place at the heart of British life and, ultimately, its empire. In 1662, Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess, arrived in England to marry King Charles II. Her dowry was immense, but she brought with her something far more culturally transformative: a personal taste for tea, a habit cultivated in the tea-loving courts of Portugal. Catherine, elegant and sophisticated, introduced tea to the English royal court, elevating it from medicinal curiosity to a fashionable drink. What was once an exotic indulgence became a symbol of refinement and social grace. Soon, the ladies of the court, eager to emulate their queen, adopted the custom. From the royal palace, tea gradually trickled down through the upper classes, eventually reaching the burgeoning middle class. Coffee houses, once the primary social hubs, began to serve tea, and eventually dedicated tea gardens emerged, offering a genteel space for socializing and sipping. By the mid-18th century, tea was no longer a luxury. It was a daily ritual, an indispensable part of British life, from the lowliest cottage to the grandest estate. Its bitter taste was often mellowed with milk and sugar, ingredients also sourced from the expanding British Empire, creating a perfect trifecta of colonial commerce. This integration of tea into the daily fabric of British society had profound implications. It fueled an insatiable demand, driving global trade and bolstering the fortunes of merchants and empires. It became a comforting constant, a moment of civilized pause in a rapidly industrializing world, a source of warmth and hospitality. For the British, tea was more than a drink. It was an identity, a shared experience that bound a nation, from the common laborer to the monarch. And as Britain's empire expanded across the globe, so too did the ubiquitous teacup, carrying with it not just a beverage, but a powerful symbol of British culture and dominance. The stage was now set for the company that would quench this national thirst, and in doing so, reshape the world. The burgeoning British thirst for tea demanded a supply chain of unparalleled scale, and one entity rose to meet this challenge, becoming an empire within an empire, the British East India Company. Formed in 1600 by royal charter, the EIC was initially a trading venture, but over 2 centuries, It evolved into a powerful corporate entity wielding immense political and military authority. From its grand headquarters in London, the company controlled vast swathes of India, commanding its own army and navy, dictating trade, and shaping the destiny of millions. It was the undisputed monarch of the tea trade, holding a near-absolute monopoly granted by the British Crown. EIC ships, colossal and heavily armed, traversed treacherous global waters, bringing tons of tea from China to Britain. This wasn't merely trade. It was an intricate web of global dominance. The company cultivated tea plantations in India, though the primary source of the cherished leaf remained China. However, purchasing vast quantities of Chinese tea created a severe trade imbalance. Britain bought far more from China than it sold. China demanded silver for its goods, and Britain's coffers were draining. To solve this, the EIC resorted to a desperate, morally reprehensible scheme: opium. The company began to forcibly cultivate opium in its Indian territories, processing it, and then illegally smuggling it into China. The Chinese, already vulnerable, became addicted, and the EIC reaped colossal profits, using the silver they received for opium to then purchase tea. It was a vicious cycle of exploitation and addiction, all in the service of satisfying a nation's craving for a morning cuppa. The East India Company was not just a commercial enterprise. It was an engine of imperialism, driven by profit and ruthlessness. Its tentacles reached across continents, influencing economies, politics, and the very fabric of societies. It was a testament to unchecked corporate power, capable of bending nations to its will, all for the sake of its bottom line. This monolithic power, however, would soon clash with a nascent spirit of independence across the Atlantic, where the very tea it so ruthlessly traded would become a flashpoint for freedom. The stage was set, not just for commerce, but for conflict. The opulent halls of British aristocracy and the ruthless boardrooms of the East India Company seemed a world away from the burgeoning settlements across the Atlantic. Yet, the same leaf that fueled Britain's global ambition also found a warm, welcoming home in the American colonies. By the mid-18th century, tea had become just as integral to colonial life as it was in the mother country. British ships, many belonging to the mighty EIC, regularly brought chests of tea to the bustling ports of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. For colonists, tea was more than just a beverage. It was a cherished ritual, a comforting connection to their British heritage. Families gathered around the tea table, sharing news and gossip, strengthening social bonds. It was offered to guests as a sign of hospitality, a staple in homes of all classes, from the wealthy merchant to the humble farmer. While some preferred the darker, bolder black teas, others enjoyed green teas, or even herbal infusions, but the overarching cultural significance remained. Tea was intertwined with daily routines, morning to evening, a moment of warmth and respite in demanding colonial lives. Indeed, the very tools of the ritual, the porcelain cups, the silver teapots, the delicate saucers, were often imported from Britain, reinforcing the cultural and economic ties that bound the colonies to the motherland. It was a shared language, a common comfort, an unspoken bond of identity. Ironically, this beloved beverage, this symbol of shared culture and heritage, was poised to become the ultimate flashpoint for division. The same East India Company that ruthlessly exploited distant lands to satisfy Britain's tea craving now controlled the supply to the colonies, tightening its grip on this essential commodity. The colonists loved their tea, but their loyalty to Britain was about to be severely tested. The comfort of the teacup, once a bridge, would soon become a chasm, separating a burgeoning nation from its imperial past, as financial pressures on the crown began to weigh heavily on the distant colonies. The comforting ritual of tea in the colonies, a testament to shared heritage, masked a growing unease. Far across the Atlantic, Britain had emerged victorious from a global conflict, but at a staggering cost. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, had been a colossal struggle for imperial dominance, pitting Britain against France across multiple continents. Britain had won, securing vast new territories in North America and solidifying its global supremacy. But victory came with an unprecedented price tag, a national debt that had nearly doubled, placing immense strain on the British treasury. The coffers were depleted, and the public back home was already heavily taxed. To replenish its funds and pay for the continued defense of its expanded empire, including the very colonies it now sought to tax, Parliament looked across the ocean. Prime Minister George Grenville initiated a series of measures designed to raise revenue directly from the American colonies, a departure from previous policies that primarily regulated trade. In 1764, the Sugar Act was passed, imposing duties on foreign molasses and other goods, directly impacting colonial rum producers and merchants. This was followed by the Currency Act, which restricted the colonies from printing their own paper money, further destabilizing their economies. These acts were not merely about money. They struck at the heart of colonial self-governance. For generations, colonists had largely managed their own affairs and taxation through their elected provincial assemblies. Now, the British Parliament, where the colonists had no elected representatives, was imposing taxes directly upon them. The cry of no taxation without representation echoed across the colonies, a powerful articulation of a fundamental grievance. It was not the amount of the tax that enraged them, but the principle, Parliament's right to levy taxes on people who had no voice in that Parliament. This was not merely an economic dispute. It was a constitutional crisis, a battle for fundamental rights and liberties. The seeds of discontent, once scattered, were now taking root, watered by parliamentary decrees that felt increasingly oppressive. The stage was being set for a confrontation, and the next act of Parliament would ignite a firestorm. The subtle tremors of discontent caused by the Sugar and Currency Acts were merely a prelude to the earthquake that followed. In 1765, the British Parliament, still grappling with its war debt, enacted the Stamp Act. This was no mere import duty. It was a direct tax on virtually every piece of paper used in the colonies. Legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, playing cards, almanacs, all had to bear a special, embossed stamp purchased with British currency. The intent was clear: to raise revenue directly from the colonies to help pay for their defense. The impact, however, was universal and immediate, touching every aspect of colonial life, from the lawyer drafting a will to the printer publishing a newspaper, from the merchant sealing a contract to the common citizen buying a deck of cards. This act, unprecedented in its scope and directness, ignited a fury that united the colonies in opposition as never before. The cry of no taxation without representation resonated with unprecedented force. Colonial leaders, who had previously grumbled in isolation, now found common cause. Secret societies, like the Sons of Liberty, emerged, their ranks swelling with artisans, merchants, and laborers. They organized boycotts of British goods, intimidated stamp distributors, and publicly protested with fervent determination, often resorting to effigy burnings and demonstrations. The economic impact was severe as trade slowed and British merchants, feeling the pinch, began to pressure Parliament for repeal. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies convened in New York for the Stamp Act Congress, an unprecedented display of intercolonial unity. They issued declarations affirming their loyalty to the king, but vehemently asserting their right to be taxed only by their own elected assemblies. The pressure, both economic and political, eventually proved too much for Parliament. In 1766, facing widespread colonial defiance and economic backlash from British merchants, Parliament reluctantly repealed the Stamp Act. The colonies erupted in celebration, believing they had won a great victory for their liberties. But the repeal came with a caveat: the Declaratory Act, which asserted Parliament's full authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. The underlying principle of parliamentary supremacy remained unchallenged by London, sowing the seeds for future conflicts. The fuse had been lit, and while the fire was momentarily extinguished, the embers of resistance glowed fiercely beneath the surface. The colonial celebrations over the Stamp Act's repeal were short-lived. Parliament, despite its concession, was unwilling to abandon its claim of absolute authority over the colonies. The Declaratory Act had ominously set the stage, and just a year later, in 1767, Chancellor of the Exchequer Charles Townshend unveiled a new legislative package designed to assert British supremacy and generate revenue, the Townshend Acts. These acts placed duties on various imported goods, including glass, lead, paints, paper, and, critically, TEA. Unlike the Stamp Act, which was an internal tax, these were external duties, ostensibly meant to regulate trade. However, their true purpose was explicitly stated: to raise revenue to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, thereby making them independent of colonial assembly control and directly loyal to the crown. This move struck at the heart of colonial self-governance. If colonial assemblies could not control the purse strings, they lost significant leverage over their own officials. The colonists, wary from the Stamp Act, immediately recognized the danger. The taxation without representation argument flared anew. Once again, colonial merchants and citizens organized non-importation agreements, boycotting British goods subject to the Townshend duties. Women, often overlooked in historical narratives, played a crucial role, organizing spinning bees to produce homespun cloth, reducing reliance on British textiles, and advocating for the boycott of British tea. Smuggling, already a common practice, intensified as a patriotic act of defiance against unjust taxes. This widespread resistance further fueled resentment in Britain, leading to increased troop deployments in colonial cities like Boston, where customs officials struggled to enforce the acts. The Townshend Acts, particularly the tax on tea, became a constant, bitter reminder of British overreach. They transformed the beloved beverage, once a symbol of shared culture and comfort, into a potent symbol of oppression. Every cup of tea now represented a choice: support British tyranny or stand for colonial liberty. This sustained period of friction, marked by boycotts, smuggling, and increasingly tense confrontations between colonists and British soldiers, would eventually escalate. The presence of British troops, ostensibly to protect customs officials, further inflamed tensions, leading to tragic events like the Boston Massacre. Parliament would eventually repeal most of the Townshend duties in 1770, but one crucial tax remained, a deliberate symbol of parliamentary authority: the tax on tea. This single, remaining duty, combined with the lingering power of the East India Company, would set the stage for the dramatic act of defiance that would forever etch Boston Harbor into the annals of American freedom. As the colonial discontent simmered beneath the surface of everyday life, a horrifying incident in March of 1770 would ignite the flames of defiance and etch itself into the nascent American memory. Boston, a city already bristling with resentment over the continued presence of British troops, became the stage for a tragic confrontation. On the evening of March 5th, a tense atmosphere hung heavy in the cold, crisp air. A lone British sentry, guarding the custom house, became embroiled in a dispute with a group of young colonists. What began as an exchange of insults and snowballs quickly escalated into something far more sinister. More soldiers arrived, bayonets fixed, pushing their way through the growing, increasingly hostile crowd. The air was thick with shouts, curses, and the crunch of ice and snow as it was hurled at the soldiers. Suddenly, amidst the chaos and confusion, a shot rang out. Then another and another. Panic erupted. When the smoke cleared and the screams subsided, 5 colonists lay dead or dying on the cobblestones. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of mixed African and Native American descent, often remembered as the first casualty of the American Revolution. The streets, moments before alive with the energy of protest, were now stained with blood. This wasn't a riot. It was immediately labeled the Boston Massacre by furious colonial leaders like Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. Revere's famous engraving, though a propagandistic exaggeration, depicted British soldiers firing mercilessly into an unarmed crowd, distributing widely throughout the colonies. This image, stark and brutal, galvanized anti-British sentiment like nothing before. The massacre laid bare the brutal reality of British military occupation and deepened a collective sense of injustice. It was a stark, bloody precedent that underscored the colonists' belief that their liberties were not just threatened, but actively under attack, hardening their resolve against what they saw as an oppressive regime. The immediate aftermath of the Boston Massacre sent shockwaves through the British Parliament. The brutality of the incident, combined with escalating non-importation agreements and widespread colonial unrest, forced London to reassess its strategy. Lord North, the new Prime Minister, understood the need to de-escalate tensions, at least temporarily. In a pragmatic move aimed at appeasing the colonies and restoring order, Parliament, in 1770, began to roll back the controversial Townshend Acts. One by one, the duties on glass, lead, paints, and paper were repealed. A collective sigh of relief seemed to sweep across the colonies. Merchants, who had borne the brunt of the boycotts, were eager to resume trade. For a brief period, an uneasy calm settled over the Atlantic. The fires of revolution, though still smoldering, seemed to dim. Many believed that Parliament had finally listened to their grievances, acknowledging the principle of no taxation without representation by withdrawing the most contentious taxes. However, this calm was deceptive. A crucial exception remained: the duty on tea. Parliament, in a stubborn assertion of its supreme authority, refused to relinquish the right to tax the colonies. Lord North, perhaps seeing it as a minor concession that preserved a major principle, left the tea tax firmly in place. This single, symbolic tax on a beloved everyday beverage became the last vestige of parliamentary power that grated on the colonial psyche. While the price of tea itself was relatively low and the duty minimal, the principle it represented was monumental. It was a constant, irksome reminder that Parliament still claimed the right to impose taxes without colonial consent. This lingering resentment, this one remaining tax, acted like a slow-burning fuse, waiting for the right spark to ignite another, far greater explosion. While the colonies wrestled with the symbolic weight of the tea tax, across the Atlantic, a monumental financial crisis was brewing, one that would irrevocably tie the fate of a global empire to the simmering frustrations of Boston. The East India Company, once the jewel in Britain's imperial crown, a mercantile giant that commanded its own army and governed vast territories in India, found itself on the precipice of collapse. By the early 1770s, this corporate behemoth, an entity as powerful as many nations, was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. The reasons were manifold: rampant corruption within its ranks, gross mismanagement of its vast operations, and staggering military expenditures in India had drained its coffers. But perhaps the most visible symptom of its distress was the staggering surplus of tea. In its warehouses across London and other British ports, millions of pounds of tea lay unsold, piling higher and higher, literally rotting in its crates. This was not just a commercial problem. It was a crisis of state. The British Treasury relied heavily on the EIC's revenues, and its collapse would send shockwaves through the entire British economy, impacting countless investors, merchants, and even the government itself. The East India Company's financial woes, therefore, became an urgent matter for Parliament. Their survival was deemed essential to the stability of the empire. The EIC, with powerful lobbyists and deep political connections, exerted immense pressure on the British government for a bailout. This desperate situation would force Parliament's hand, leading to a fateful decision that, far from saving the company, would instead ignite the American Revolution. The stage was being meticulously set, not by grand political design, but by a chain of unintended consequences, corruption, and an overwhelming surplus of a single, highly coveted commodity: tea. Faced with the imminent collapse of the East India Company, the British Parliament intervened with a solution that seemed, on the surface, entirely logical. In May of 1773, it passed the Tea Act. The primary goal of this legislation was clear: to rescue the ailing EIC from financial ruin by making its vast stockpiles of unsold tea competitive in the colonial market. The act granted the EIC a monopoly on tea sales to the colonies, allowing it to bypass colonial merchants and sell directly to appointed consignees. Crucially, the Tea Act also lowered the price of EIC tea. It effectively removed the British duties on tea exported from Britain, meaning that the EIC could sell its product in America cheaper than ever before, even with the remaining Townsend duty still attached. From a purely economic standpoint, it was a win-win. The EIC would offload its surplus and American colonists would enjoy cheaper tea. The British government even believed that the colonists, enticed by the low prices, would quietly accept the small remaining tax, thus implicitly acknowledging Parliament's right to tax them. But what Parliament saw as a benevolent bailout, or at worst, a clever workaround, the colonists perceived as a profound betrayal. It wasn't about the price of tea, it was about the principle of self-governance. The Act effectively cemented Parliament's power to levy taxes without colonial consent, directly undermining the authority of colonial assemblies. It bypassed and threatened to ruin colonial merchants, who had previously acted as middlemen. This seemingly minor tweak to tea commerce was, in the eyes of the colonists, not a gift of cheaper tea, but a Trojan horse designed to smuggle in an undisputed assertion of British supremacy. The paradox was startling. The British government offered cheaper tea, yet the colonies erupted in a fury more intense than any previous tax dispute. To understand this seemingly counterintuitive reaction, we must look beyond the mere cost and delve into the core principles at stake. For the colonists, the Tea Act was not an act of generosity. It was a calculated assault on their economic autonomy and political rights. Firstly, the Act granted the East India Company a virtual monopoly on tea sales, allowing it to bypass colonial merchants. For generations, these local merchants had been the lifeblood of colonial commerce, acting as importers and distributors. The Tea Act threatened to put them out of business, concentrating immense economic power in the hands of a single, distant British corporation. This wasn't just unfair competition. It was an imperial measure designed to control and exploit the colonial economy for the benefit of British interests, further tightening the chains of dependence. Secondly, and perhaps most critically, the Tea Act reaffirmed Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. The lower price was a bait designed to tempt colonists into accepting the underlying principle of taxation without representation. Colonial leaders understood this perfectly. Samuel Adams famously warned that if they accepted the cheaper tea, they would be tacitly agreeing to Parliament's right to tax anything it pleased, thereby surrendering their hard-won liberties. The fight wasn't about a few pennies on a pound of tea. It was about who held the ultimate power, colonial assemblies representing the people, or a distant Parliament across the ocean. It was an attack on the very concept of self-governance, a clear sign that Britain intended to maintain absolute control, no matter the cost. The cheaper tea was not a bargain, but a bribe, and the colonists refused to be bought. The Tea Act, far from quelling colonial unrest, ignited a fury that galvanized the most ardent patriots. The Sons of Liberty, who had been relatively dormant during the period of calm, now sprang back into action with renewed vigor. Led by impassioned figures like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, they understood the insidious nature of the Tea Act and wasted no time in mobilizing widespread resistance across the colonies. Their strategy was multifaceted and highly effective. Committees of correspondence, networks of communication established years earlier, buzzed with urgent dispatches, spreading news of the Tea Act's implications and rallying support for united action. Public meetings were convened in towns and cities, becoming forums for fiery speeches that denounced the Act as a violation of fundamental rights. Pamphlets and broadsides, printed swiftly and distributed widely, elucidated the dangers of the parliamentary monopoly and the principle of taxation without representation, stirring the populace to anger and defiance. The Sons of Liberty focused their immediate efforts on preventing the East India Company's tea from ever reaching colonial markets. They pressured the designated tea consignees, those merchants appointed by the EIC to receive and sell the tea, forcing many to resign their positions under threat of public scorn and even violence. Their message was clear: no one would profit from this illegitimate tax. Preparations for direct action were underway, particularly in Boston, where the atmosphere crackled with anticipation. The Sons of Liberty were not merely protesting. They were preparing to directly thwart the will of Parliament, setting the stage for a confrontation that would irrevocably alter the course of history. The spirit of defiance was now palpable, tangible, ready to manifest in a dramatic collective act of resistance. As autumn turned to winter in 1773, the stage for confrontation was set, and Boston, once again, found itself at the epicenter. The East India Company, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the rising colonial fury, dispatched its tea-laden ships across the Atlantic. The first to arrive was the Dartmouth, sailing into Boston Harbor in late November, its holds packed with 114 chests of the controversial cargo. It was quickly followed by the Eleanor and the Beaver, arriving a few weeks later, bringing the total to a staggering 342 chests, worth nearly 10,000 pounds sterling, a fortune in that era. The arrival of these ships plunged Boston into a desperate dilemma. According to British law, once the ships had entered the harbor, their cargo had to be unloaded and the customs duties paid within 20 days. If this deadline passed, customs officials were legally empowered to seize the tea and sell it at auction. This would effectively force the colonists' hand, making it impossible to prevent the hated tea from entering the market and thereby implicitly accepting the Tea Act. Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson, a staunch loyalist and a man deeply invested in the authority of the Crown, stood firm. He refused to grant the ships clearance to leave Boston Harbor without unloading their cargo and paying the duties. His two sons were, in fact, among the tea consignees, further fueling colonial suspicion of corruption. For the colonists, led by the Sons of Liberty, the objective was non-negotiable. The tea would not be landed. The ships remained anchored, bobbing idly in the cold harbor waters, symbols of an empire's stubborn will and a colony's unyielding defiance. The clock was ticking, and with each passing day, Boston became a pressure cooker, nearing its breaking point. As the 20-day deadline loomed on December 16, 1773, Boston reached its moment of reckoning. The fate of the East India Company's tea, and with it, the assertion of colonial liberty, hung precariously in the balance. Thousands of colonists, spurred by the Sons of Liberty and the urgency of the moment, converged upon the Old South Meeting House, one of Boston's largest public venues. The church, typically a place of worship, transformed into a crucible of revolution. Every pew, every aisle, every available space was packed. An estimated 5,000 to 7,000 people, a significant portion of Boston's population, crammed inside or stood outside, straining to hear the passionate speeches and participate in the collective decision. Leading figures of the resistance, including the fiery Samuel Adams and the eloquent Josiah Quincy Jr., addressed the throng. They recounted the history of British oppression, reiterated the principles of no taxation without representation, and argued forcefully against allowing the tea to land. The air was thick with tension, punctuated by shouts of agreement and impassioned pleas. The meeting extended for hours, becoming a powerful expression of the collective will of the people. As dusk fell, a messenger arrived from Governor Hutchinson. His reply to the Assembly's final demand that the ships be allowed to leave without duties was unequivocal, a flat refusal. The news was met with a grave silence, then a low murmur that quickly rose to a roar. At that moment, Samuel Adams rose and, with a gravitas that belied the simplicity of his words, declared, "This meeting can do nothing further to save the country." It was a prearranged signal. As if on cue, a war whoop erupted from the back of the church, signaling the beginning of one of the most audacious acts of defiance in American history. The decision had been made, not by a distant parliament, but by the united voice of the people in the heart of Boston. The flickering candlelight barely pierced the gloom of the Boston taverns where the Sons of Liberty gathered, their whispers echoing the mounting tension in the city. The arrival of the tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and soon the Beaver, had brought the standoff to a boiling point. For days, Governor Hutchinson had refused to allow the tea to be sent back to England, effectively trapping Boston between imperial decree and colonial fury. But the colonists, led by figures like Samuel Adams, were not without a plan. They knew a direct confrontation with British troops was a path to certain slaughter. Their act had to be precise, symbolic, and crucially, shrouded in a degree of anonymity to protect the participants and create a powerful visual message. The decision was made. They would disguise themselves, not as common citizens, but as something far more potent and resonant: Mohawk Indians. This choice was deliberate, layered with meaning. It was a nod to America's indigenous inhabitants, symbolically rejecting European identity and reclaiming a Native American spirit. It provided a thin, yet effective, veil of plausible deniability, confusing British authorities and offering a powerful, unified image of resistance. Across Boston, in the clandestine corners of workshops and homes, men began to prepare. Faces were darkened with soot and lampblack. Hands tied, feather headdresses, and scraps of blankets were fashioned into rough, Indian attire. These weren't mere costumes. They were a transformation, a shedding of civilian identity to embrace a collective, rebellious persona. The meticulous planning extended beyond disguises. They organized into small, disciplined groups, each assigned specific tasks, each sworn to secrecy and nonviolence, save for the destruction of the tea itself. The stage was set for an unprecedented act of defiance, a silent promise to King George III that this stolen tea would be far more than just merchandise. It would be a catalyst. As dusk fell on December 16, 1773, Boston pulsed with a restless energy. Thousands had gathered at the Old South Meeting House, its walls barely containing the fervent debate about the tea. Samuel Adams, a master orator, held the crowd captive, his voice a steady drumbeat of defiance. When word finally arrived that Governor Hutchinson remained unyielding, a single cry pierced the air, growing into a thunderous roar. "Boston Harbor, a teapot tonight." It was the signal. From the meeting house, a stream of men, now subtly transformed by their rough disguises, began to flow into the cold night. They were joined by others, emerging from alleys and side streets, all converging towards Griffin's Wharf. The atmosphere was electric, a potent mix of anticipation and steely resolve. Yet there was no mob rule. This was a disciplined, almost military procession. Over 100 individuals, members of the Sons of Liberty and their allies, moved with a quiet, determined purpose. They marched in orderly files, their steps echoing softly on the cobblestones. Torches cast dancing shadows, illuminating their darkened faces and crude Indian attire. Bystanders lined the streets, a silent testament to the collective understanding of the gravity of the moment. Reaching Griffin's Wharf, the three tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, lay dark and waiting, symbols of an empire's stubborn will. The disciplined nature of the protest was paramount. Any act of unruliness or theft could be twisted by British propaganda. Their target was singular: the tea. Everything else, every ship's fitting, every personal belonging of the crew, was to remain untouched. This was not anarchy. This was a surgical strike against an unjust law, performed with an almost sacred precision under the watchful gaze of a moonlit Boston sky. Under the pale glow of the winter moon, a new kind of cargo operation began on Griffin's Wharf. The Mohawks boarded the ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor, and Beaver, with remarkable efficiency. Sentinels were posted, ensuring no one interfered, no one stole anything beyond the tea itself. The holds of the vessels, once filled with the aromatic promise of exotic leaves, now became a stage for revolutionary theater. With hatchets and axes, the colonists pried open the heavy wooden chests, each containing hundreds of pounds of tea. The satisfying crack of wood splintering filled the night air, followed by the rustle of loose tea leaves cascading onto the deck, then over the rail, into the dark, cold waters of Boston Harbor. The scale of the destruction was immense, and deliberately so. For nearly 3 hours, working in shifts, the men systematically emptied 340 chests of British East India Company tea. That's approximately 92,000 pounds of tea, a fortune then valued at over 10,000 pounds, an astronomical sum, equivalent to millions in today's currency. The aroma of brewing tea, usually a comforting scent, now mingled with the briny tang of the sea, creating a strange, unprecedented saltwater brew. The destruction was absolute, yet contained. There was no looting, no violence against the ship crews, no damage to the ships themselves beyond the open hatches and broken chests. This was a protest, not a riot. It was a precise, calculated act designed to send an unmistakable message across the Atlantic. Boston would not yield to taxation without representation. As the last chest was emptied and the tide began to carry the submerged tea leaves out to sea, the Mohawks silently dispersed, leaving behind a harbor transformed into a defiant, tea-stained symbol of colonial resolve. As the first gray light of dawn broke over Boston Harbor, a strange and potent aroma hung in the crisp winter air, the unmistakable scent of tea. Thousands of pounds of it, now mixed with salt water and seaweed, washed ashore or drifted sluggishly on the tide. The harbor, usually a bustling artery of trade, was now a silent, surreal testament to the night's audacious defiance. Curious citizens, both jubilant and apprehensive, came down to the wharves to gaze upon the spectacle, a defiant saltwater brew that would forever mark this city. The immediate reactions were a tempest of conflicting emotions. Among many colonists, there was a palpable sense of triumph, a swell of pride in their countrymen's daring. Cheers erupted in some quarters, and broadsides quickly circulated, praising the Mohawks as heroes. But beneath the celebratory facade, a tremor of apprehension ran through others. They knew the magnitude of the act. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, stripped of his authority and utterly humiliated, could only survey the damage with a grim face, understanding that the point of no return had been crossed. The British authorities, initially incredulous, struggled to grasp the sheer audacity and disciplined nature of the protest. This was no common riot. It was an organized assault on imperial policy, a direct challenge to the Crown's authority. Reports swiftly sailed across the Atlantic, carrying news of the unprecedented destruction. London, already exasperated by colonial unrest, would soon receive a message that transcended the mere loss of property. It was a declaration, steeped in tea, that echoed louder than any spoken word, setting the stage for a dramatic and inevitable escalation of the conflict. News of the Boston Tea Party hit London like a cannon shot. The British government, already frustrated by years of colonial defiance, reacted with unbridled fury. This was not merely the destruction of property. It was a direct affront to the king's authority, a flagrant act of rebellion that could not go unpunished. King George III himself was incensed, demanding swift and decisive action. Lord North, the Prime Minister, echoed this sentiment, declaring that the die is cast and that Massachusetts must be brought to heel. The response was a series of punitive laws, quickly passed by Parliament in the spring of 1774, designed to crush Boston's rebellious spirit and send a chilling message to all the other colonies. These were officially known as the Coercive Acts, but to the colonists, they became infamously known as the Intolerable Acts. The first, and perhaps most devastating, was the Boston Port Act, which effectively closed Boston Harbor to all shipping until the destroyed tea was paid for. This was a death sentence for a city built on maritime trade. Next came the Massachusetts Government Act, which stripped the colony of its self-governance, replacing elected officials with royal appointees and severely restricting town meetings. The Administration of Justice Act, derisively dubbed the Murder Act by colonists, allowed British officials accused of crimes in Massachusetts to be tried in Britain or other colonies, effectively ensuring they would escape justice. Finally, an expanded Quartering Act mandated that colonial authorities provide housing for British troops, even in private homes, if necessary. These acts were a clear attempt to isolate, punish, and humble Massachusetts, extinguishing the flame of rebellion before it could spread. But London's fury, intended to intimidate, would instead ignite a far greater conflagration. The intolerable acts descended upon Boston like a suffocating shroud. On June 1, 1774, the Boston Port Act officially took effect, slamming shut the city's lifeblood. The bustling wharves, once teeming with merchant ships and goods from around the world, fell silent and deserted. Forest-like masts stood idle, ghostly silhouettes against the sky. The thriving economy of Boston, built on centuries of maritime trade, ground to a sudden, catastrophic halt. Thousands of dock workers, sailors, rope makers, and merchants found themselves instantly unemployed, their livelihoods extinguished overnight. Adding to the city's torment, General Thomas Gage, the newly appointed military governor, arrived with 4 regiments of British troops. Boston, a city that prided itself on its independence, was effectively placed under martial law. Redcoats patrolled the streets, their bright uniforms a constant, unwelcome reminder of imperial authority. The vibrant colonial hub transformed into a besieged city, its inhabitants facing not just economic ruin, but the daily humiliation of military occupation. Food became scarce, prices soared, and poverty spread like wildfire. The air grew heavy with a sense of desperation and simmering resentment. London had intended to isolate Boston, to make an example of it. Yet, paradoxically, the severity of Boston's punishment began to stir a powerful wave of sympathy throughout the other colonies. From the fields of Virginia to the bustling streets of Philadelphia, communities began to rally. Food, clothing, and funds were collected and sent overland to their suffering brethren in Massachusetts. The British government's iron fist, meant to crush dissent, was instead forging an unexpected and unprecedented unity, drawing the colonies closer in a shared outrage against what they perceived as an intolerable tyranny. The British gamble had backfired spectacularly. Far from isolating Massachusetts, the intolerable acts had ignited a firestorm of outrage across all 13 colonies. The shared experience of Boston's suffering transformed abstract principles into tangible injustice, fostering a profound sense of intercolonial solidarity. Messengers on horseback crisscrossed the vast colonial landscape, carrying urgent letters, news of Boston's plight, and calls for a unified response. The sentiment was clear. If Boston could be so brutally punished, no colony was safe. It was time for a common front. This burgeoning unity culminated in a momentous decision to convene a Continental Congress. In September 1774, 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia, still grappling with Native American conflicts and relying on British military aid, did not send representatives initially, converged in Philadelphia. They gathered in Carpenter's Hall, a modest but symbolically significant venue chosen for its independence from royal authority. This was not a gathering of revolutionaries intent on war. Not yet. Many still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, but on terms of equality and respect. Yet, the very act of their assembly was revolutionary. For the first time, disparate colonies, often at odds with each other, sat down as one body to address a common threat. Among the delegates were some of the most influential minds and figures of the era. John Adams, the fiery advocate for Massachusetts, George Washington, the stoic Virginian who commanded immense respect, and Patrick Henry, whose passionate calls for liberty would soon resonate throughout the nation. Their task was immense: to articulate colonial grievances, assert their rights as British subjects, and devise a unified strategy to compel Parliament to repeal the intolerable acts. The First Continental Congress marked a pivotal step, transforming localized protests into a continental movement, setting a course for collective action that would irreversibly alter the destiny of a fledgling nation. The First Continental Congress, though united in its outrage, grappled with the question of how to respond effectively without resorting to immediate armed conflict. The delegates understood the power of economic leverage, a weapon the colonies had wielded before, albeit on a smaller scale. Their answer was the Association, a powerful, comprehensive agreement adopted on October 20th, 1774, that represented a unified economic front against Great Britain. This was not just a suggestion. It was a binding pact, a promise of collective action. The association called for a complete cessation of trade with Britain. First, a non-importation policy. No British goods were to be brought into the colonies. Second, non-consumption. Colonists pledged to avoid buying or using British products already in America. And finally, if their demands were not met, a non-exportation policy would take effect, halting the flow of vital colonial raw materials to Britain. To enforce these ambitious measures, the Congress established local committees of observation and inspection in every county, city, and town. These committees were charged with monitoring compliance, publicizing violations, and encouraging patriotic adherence to the boycott. This bottom-up enforcement mechanism gave ordinary citizens a direct role in the resistance, fostering a widespread sense of shared responsibility and empowerment. This was economic warfare on an unprecedented scale, a nonviolent but profoundly impactful form of protest. The delegates believed that by hitting Britain where it hurt most, in its coffers, they could force Parliament to rescind the intolerable acts and acknowledge colonial rights. The association showcased a remarkable level of colonial unity and resolve, demonstrating that the colonies were prepared to endure significant economic hardship themselves to defend their liberties. It was a clear signal that the struggle for freedom would be fought not just with words, but with collective sacrifice, setting the stage for the dramatic events that would follow. The stolen tea had ignited a fire, and now the colonies were fanning the flames with a powerful, unified economic boycott. The ripples from Boston Harbor, initially a tempest of protest, had now surged into a tsunami of armed rebellion. The British Crown, stung by the audacity of the colonists and determined to reassert its absolute authority, began to tighten its grip, perceiving the acts of defiance, like the destruction of the tea, as direct challenges to the very fabric of empire. But the colonists, hardened by years of perceived injustice and emboldened by their acts of unified resistance, were equally resolved. The perceived stolen tea had, in fact, been a symbolic theft of British economic control, and now the British sought to reclaim what they saw as their rightful dominion, by force if necessary. As 1775 dawned, the air in Massachusetts crackled with an undeniable tension. General Thomas Gage, the British military governor, received urgent orders from London. Seize colonial arms caches and arrest the firebrands, the radical leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who had stoked the flames of resistance, often in the very taverns and meeting halls where the Tea Party had been conceived. These leaders, hunted by the Empire, were now symbols of a burgeoning nation's defiance. On the night of April 18, 1775, Gage dispatched a column of roughly 700 British regulars, elite soldiers of the Crown, under the cloak of darkness, to Concord, a town suspected of hoarding munitions, and with a secondary objective to apprehend Adams and Hancock in nearby Lexington. But the colonial intelligence network, honed by years of covert resistance, was already active. The famous rides of Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, under the glow of a full moon, pierced the quiet night, spreading the alarm that the regulars were out. These weren't just messengers. They were the nerves of a nascent rebellion, communicating a call to arms that transcended mere rumor. As dawn broke on April 19th, a small company of colonial militia, known as Minutemen, stood assembled on Lexington Green. These were ordinary farmers, artisans, and shopkeepers, but they were extraordinary in their resolve, ready to defend their liberty at a minute's notice. They numbered perhaps 77, facing down a disciplined force of hundreds of British regulars, their scarlet coats a vivid, intimidating spectacle against the greening landscape. The exact sequence of events remains debated, lost to the fog of war and time, but a single shot rang out, igniting the conflagration. This shot heard round the world, echoed not just across that small village green, but across continents, declaring that the era of peaceful protest was over. The British advanced, firing volleys, killing several militiamen before marching on to Concord. There, a larger engagement at the North Bridge saw the colonists, now bolstered by reinforcements, successfully repel the British. What began as an attempt to suppress a rebellion instead ignited a full-scale war. The Tea Party had demonstrated a willingness to defy. Lexington and Concord proved a willingness to die for that defiance, irreversibly setting the colonies on a path to open conflict and a fight for self-determination that would redefine the course of human history. The echoes of musket fire from Lexington and Concord reverberated throughout the colonies, hardening resolve and shattering any lingering illusions of reconciliation with Great Britain. What had once been a fight for rights within the British Empire, exemplified by the Boston Tea Party's protest against taxation without representation, now undeniably transformed into a battle for complete separation. Yet, the leap from resisting unfair taxes to declaring outright independence was monumental, fraught with immense risks, and required a powerful intellectual argument to unify a diverse populace. Enter Thomas Paine, an English immigrant who had arrived in America just a year prior, carrying a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. Paine, with his fervent belief in Enlightenment ideals and a remarkable ability to articulate complex ideas in plain language, would provide that argument. In January 1776, Paine published a pamphlet titled Common Sense. This slim, unassuming volume, printed on cheap paper and distributed widely across the colonies, became an overnight sensation, selling an unprecedented 100,000 copies in its first 3 months alone, the equivalent of tens of millions today. It wasn't just a bestseller, it was a revolution in print. Paine's Common Sense was a blistering, no-holds-barred attack on the very concept of monarchy and hereditary rule. He dismantled the legitimacy of King George III, whom he famously dubbed the royal brood of Britain, and argued forcefully for the inherent right of the American colonies to govern themselves. With clear, accessible prose, Paine cut through the complex legal and philosophical debates, appealing directly to the common person's understanding of justice and reason. He argued that it was absurd for an island to rule a continent, that America had outgrown its parent country, and that the only logical and practical path forward was complete independence. He connected the struggle not just to grievances like the Tea Act, but to universal principles of liberty and self-determination. The pamphlet's impact was immediate and profound. It wasn't merely read. It was debated in taverns, preached from pulpits, and discussed in town squares, fueling a dramatic shift in public opinion. Where once many colonists had harbored hopes of remaining British subjects while securing their rights, Paine's lucid arguments galvanized support for a decisive break. The defiance of the Boston Tea Party, once seen as radical and perhaps even reckless, was now reframed as a necessary prelude, a bold act that had prepared the ground for this ultimate declaration. Common Sense provided the intellectual and moral framework, the persuasive narrative that transformed a disparate collection of grievances into a unified, coherent call for a new, independent nation. It was the pen that would give purpose and direction to the sword already drawn at Lexington, setting the stage for the most audacious declaration in human history. With the intellectual groundwork laid by Common Sense and the hostilities already ignited, the Second Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, finally took the momentous step. On July 2nd, 1776, they voted for independence, and 2 days later, on July 4th, adopted the Declaration of Independence, a document that articulated humanity's fundamental rights and formally severed ties with Great Britain. This wasn't merely a political statement. It was a profound act of defiance, echoing the earlier, symbolic defiance of the Boston Tea Party on a grander, national scale. Now, the fledgling nation faced the arduous task of turning that declaration into a reality, a task that would require years of brutal warfare against the most powerful military in the world. At the heart of this struggle was the Continental Army, a patchwork force formed from colonial militias, led by the steadfast George Washington. His leadership, more than any single battle, would become the linchpin of American survival. The early years of the war were a testament to the sheer resilience of the colonists. Faced with a well-trained, well-supplied British army, the Americans endured crushing defeats, brutal winters, and constant shortages. Places like Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, in the winter of 1777 to 1778, became crucible moments. Thousands of soldiers perished from disease and starvation, yet the core of the army, fueled by the revolutionary spirit kindled by events like the Tea Party and the ideals of independence, held together, unwilling to relinquish the dream of freedom. The tide began to turn with crucial victories. The Battle of Saratoga in 1777, where American forces decisively defeated a major British army, proved to the world, particularly to France, that the Americans could win. This victory was a diplomatic coup, securing a vital alliance with France, which provided desperately needed financial aid, naval support, and military assistance. French intervention transformed a colonial rebellion into a global conflict, stretching British resources thin across multiple fronts. Spain and the Netherlands also joined the fray, further isolating Britain. Years of hard-fought battles, strategic retreats, and remarkable perseverance followed. Finally, in October 1781, the combined American and French forces cornered General Cornwallis's British army at Yorktown, Virginia. After a grueling siege, Cornwallis was forced to surrender, a crushing blow that effectively ended major hostilities. While minor skirmishes continued, the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, officially recognized the United States of America as a free and independent nation, granting it vast western territories. The spirit of resistance, born in the Boston streets and solidified in the waters of its harbor, had propelled a disparate group of colonies through 8 long years of conflict, culminating in the improbable birth of a new republic dedicated to liberty and self-governance. With independence secured and the war won, the newly formed United States faced a monumental task, not just to build a government, but to forge a distinct national identity. This identity, shaped by the recent struggle against British oppression, began to manifest in surprising ways, even in the most mundane aspects of daily life. And perhaps nowhere was this shift more symbolic than in the rejection of a beloved beverage that had once been synonymous with British culture: tea. Before the Revolution, tea was omnipresent in colonial homes, a cherished ritual inherited from the mother country. But after the Boston Tea Party and the subsequent war, tea became inextricably linked with the very tyranny the Americans had fought to overthrow. It was the symbol of British taxation, British control, and British arrogance. To consume tea after 1783 was, for many, an act of disloyalty, a tacit acceptance of the very customs they had shed blood to escape. This wasn't merely a preference. It was a conscious, patriotic choice. In its place, another beverage rose to prominence, becoming a symbol of American independence: coffee. Coffee, which had been imported but less widely consumed than tea, now surged in popularity. It wasn't burdened by the colonial past. It wasn't British. Its earthy, robust flavor became associated with the hard-working, independent spirit of the new republic. Coffee houses, already present, multiplied, becoming vibrant hubs of political discussion, business dealings, and social interaction. Embodying the democratic spirit of the age, a stark contrast to the more formal, class-conscious tea rituals of the British aristocracy. This shift was actively encouraged. Newspaper advertisements promoted coffee as the drink of liberty, while patriotic citizens proudly served it in their homes. President Thomas Jefferson himself was a notable coffee enthusiast, reportedly consuming copious amounts. The economic implications were also significant. The burgeoning American merchant fleet, no longer constrained by British trade laws, could now import coffee directly from various global sources, fostering new trade relationships and further distancing the nation from its former colonial master. The rejection of tea was more than just a culinary preference. It was a cultural divorce. It solidified coffee's place in the American cultural landscape, not just as a drink, but as an emblem of freedom, a daily reminder that the American experiment was fundamentally different, forged in the fires of revolution, and determined to carve its own path, even in something as seemingly trivial as a morning brew. The stolen tea had not just sparked a war. It had fundamentally reshaped the American palate and identity. The Boston Tea Party, at its core, was never truly about tea. It was about principle. The destruction of 342 chests of tea in Boston Harbor was an act of economic sabotage. Yes, but it was profoundly symbolic, a visceral rejection of the fundamental injustice of taxation without representation. This wasn't merely a localized grievance. It was an embodiment of Enlightenment ideals that questioned the very nature of governance and the rights of the governed. The colonists understood that to yield on the small tax on tea was to concede the larger principle, that their property and livelihoods could be arbitrarily seized by a distant power in which they had no voice. The price of that principle was immense. Years of war, countless lives lost, and the complete upheaval of their society. Yet, the clarity of that principle resonated far beyond the American colonies. The success of the American Revolution, ignited by acts of defiance like the Tea Party, sent a powerful, undeniable message across the globe. It demonstrated that ordinary citizens, united by a common cause, could successfully challenge and overthrow even the most formidable empires. It solidified the then radical notion that legitimate government derived its power from the consent of the governed, not from divine right or hereditary claims. The concepts of popular sovereignty, natural rights, and the right to revolution, once confined to philosophical treatises, had now been tested in the crucible of war and emerged victorious. The Boston Tea Party, as a dramatic precursor to this victory, became a potent symbol for other oppressed peoples and nascent independence movements around the world. Its influence can be seen in the fervor of the French Revolution, just years later, which adopted many of the same Enlightenment principles of liberty and equality. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, as colonial empires began to unravel, the narrative of American self-liberation, spearheaded by defiant acts against perceived injustice, provided a blueprint and inspiration. From Latin American independence movements to anti-colonial struggles in Asia and Africa, the idea that a people had the right to self-governance, to reject economic exploitation and political subjugation, found fertile ground. Today, the Boston Tea Party continues to stand as a powerful global message. It's a reminder that true freedom is often achieved not through convenience, but through conviction, that principled stands, even those that seem radical at the time, can lay the foundation for profound and lasting change. It underscores that the destruction of property, when driven by a profound moral grievance and a demand for fundamental rights, can serve as a catalyst for justice, transforming a single act of protest into a universal symbol of the relentless human pursuit of freedom. Our journey began with a beloved beverage, a simple commodity imported from distant lands, and traced its astonishing transformation into the ultimate flashpoint for revolution. From the delicate porcelain cups of British aristocracy to the rough-hewn crates heaved into Boston Harbor, tea, above all else, became a symbol. It was a symbol of British imperial power, of economic control, and ultimately, of colonial defiance. This stolen tea, or rather, the deliberately destroyed tea, was not merely an act of vandalism. It was a theatrical, audacious declaration that the colonists would no longer be silent, no longer be subjects to arbitrary rule. That single act on a cold December night in 1773 set in motion an irreversible chain of events. It hardened British resolve, leading to the intolerable acts, which in turn united the colonies in their common opposition. It fueled the fiery rhetoric of patriots, transforming abstract grievances into tangible injustices. It paved the way for the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord, morphing protest into armed conflict. It inspired Thomas Paine's common sense, giving the burgeoning revolution a powerful, unifying voice for independence. And it sustained the spirit of resistance throughout 8 long years of war, culminating in the impossible, the birth of the United States of America. The Boston Tea Party, therefore, is far more than just a historical anecdote. It is a foundational myth, a powerful symbol woven into the very fabric of American identity. It stands as an enduring testament to the power of grassroots activism, the courage to challenge injustice, and the profound consequences that can arise from a single, decisive act of defiance. It reminds us that freedom often comes with a cost, but that the pursuit of self-governance and representation is a universal, unyielding human aspiration. It is a story of how ordinary citizens, pushed to their limits, can rise up and change the course of history, not just for themselves, but for generations yet unborn. Today, the images of colonists disguised as Mohawks, dumping tea into the dark waters, remain instantly recognizable, a vivid tableau of American resistance. It reminds us that our nation was forged in defiance, born from a principled stand against perceived tyranny, and shaped by the courage to act. The Boston Tea Party, a bold, rebellious act of stolen tea, ultimately ignited the flame of freedom, transforming a harbor protest into the cornerstone of a nation, forever etching its dramatic narrative into the annals of history. Its legacy continues to resonate, a perpetual echo of liberty across the centuries, a reminder that the price of principle is sometimes paid in tea and sometimes in blood, but always in the unwavering pursuit of freedom. The echoes of that frigid December night in Boston Harbor still resonate today. What began as a desperate act of protest against a perceived injustice, fueled by the burden of taxed tea, transformed into one of the most iconic catalysts for independence in human history. This stolen tea of 1773 carries layered meanings. It was a symbolic rejection of economic exploitation, a forceful reclaiming of self-governance, and a literal destruction of a commodity that had become synonymous with tyranny. From a single cup, a revolution brewed. This documentary has shown how ordinary citizens, united by shared principles and a fierce demand for accountability, can ignite monumental change against even the most formidable powers. The Boston Tea Party stands as an enduring testament to the power of collective defiance and the courage to challenge the status quo. It reminds us that consumer power, government oversight, and the fundamental right to protest are intertwined threads in the fabric of a free society. The spirit of those sons of liberty, who dared to disrupt the norm and forge their own destiny, continues to inspire. The questions they posed about representation, fairness, and freedom remain vital touchstones in contemporary discussions worldwide. The tea may have been lost to the waves, but the powerful message it carried, that liberty is worth fighting for, endures, an unyielding flame in the heart of a nation born of defiance.